our company is laser focused on clean fuels. So that's electro fuels, right? So taking electricity and making fuels that can help decarbonize transportation, industry, heating, and so on, right? So that's where our interest lies, right? It's taking clean electricity from Ontario's grid system, in this case, making hydrogen and creating a hydrogen hub for transportation fuel, but potentially also for a feedstock to make ammonia. Now, when you guys think of ammonia, you think of anhydrous, which is great. You know, I'll show you later. Ammonia is also a fuel that a lot of experts around the world are thinking is a key to decarbonizing industries like power generation and maritime fuels. Okay. So a little background on power to ag. That name came from a farmer that suggested it. I thought it was a great title for the project because really it brings together Huron Bruce, right? So in Bruce County up where we are, which is where back in 2016 we started talking to regional and municipal governments about a project that we want to develop, which I'm here to present. Up in Bruce, you know, clean power sort of rules the day. Down here in Huron County, I think it's pretty clear agriculture rules the day. So what we're talking about is bringing together both of those strengths from the region and taking clean electricity to help decarbonize the agricultural industry and simultaneously building infrastructure that's going to help decarbonize other sectors such as maritime fuels, for example, and power generation in the future. You might have noticed there, it also said, you know, the title of the project is a clean fertilizer project. We're designing the project to be as aligned with the Ontario low carbon hydrogen strategy, which came out in April of this past year, to be an ideal project candidate under that strategy. So, I assume a lot of you know this. Some of it, you know, may be redundant, but I'll explain it anyhow. Like how ammonia is made determines whether it's clean or dirty, and the vast majority of all ammonia in the world is made with fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, depending on where it's made. Anhydrous is ammonia. There's no difference. It's the exact same molecule, as you guys probably know. Where the hydrogen comes from, if it's from fossil fuels, there's a lot of greenhouse gases that are emitted in the production of that ammonia molecule. Our project is to build a hydrogen hub, and we think there's a great hydrogen hub opportunity here in Huron County. Well, one of the baseload end users, while we wait for, you'll see cars, trucks, tractors, you name it, that are going to use hydrogen fuel in the future, one great baseload application right now could be to make anhydrous. Now, depending on who I talk to, you know, some know more than others, but I'll admit, until I got into the hydrogen industry back in 2009, and it was only really in 2016 that I started seeing, okay, well, where is all of this hydrogen coming from to make all of this ammonia, to make fertilizer and nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers around the world? Well, it's largely 95+% or more coming from fossil fuels. So, okay, well, what is the nitrogen fertilizer chain? What is it? And I just want to show this because I'll admit I wasn't aware of it. Some of you may be, but some of you may find it interesting. So, like anhydrous ammonia is the basic building block of all nitrogen fertilizers. It's not just the fertilizer in and of itself. It's, if you don't have anhydrous, you can't make any other synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So you can see here, you know, the percentages, which you guys know off by heart, but to make, for example, you know, the urea side, right? You need carbon dioxide. So you need anhydrous, you need carbon dioxide. You play with some chemistry, you can make urea. On the ammonium nitrate side, you need anhydrous as the basic building block, you need oxygen. You play with some chemistry and you can make ammonium nitrate. As most of you guys probably know, UAN stands for urea ammonium nitrate. Combine the two, you can get your 2832 and whatnot, but it's just combining urea and ammonium nitrate. So all of the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer chain comes from ammonia, comes from anhydrous. So, of course, there's ammonium sulfate, calcium nitrate mapped up. Off to the sides, you need different sulfur and, you know, phosphoric acids and these sorts of things to make those products. So, I would never come in front of a group of farmers and try to talk any farmer into what type of nitrogen fertilizer to use. That's not what I'm here to talk about. But I do want to show that we think, based on the hydrogen hub concept here in Huron Bruce, there are two nitrogen fertilizers that can be made with nothing more than electricity and water. Right? And those two are anhydrous, which we'll show, and ammonium nitrate. So, you know, we do have a vision to create this hydrogen hub in the Huron Bruce area, especially in the Huron area, and specifically what we're determined to do is try and develop a clean hydrogen, clean ammonia, and maybe someday ammonium nitrate fertilizer plant at the former Blue Water Detention Center in Central Huron. So ammonia is a fuel. It's a crappy fuel, you know, it's about half as good as diesel, let's call it, but it is a fuel in its own right. And you can see that's a quote from the Ontario Low Carbon Hydrogen Strategy, and I'm glad they said that, because the reality is that if you look at what the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, what it says needs to happen with ammonia production over the next couple of decades, if we're even half serious about climate solutions, okay? So this is where we're at in 2020. You can see how much ammonia demand there is globally. All of that largely is mainly for fertilizer, right? And almost all of it at this time is made from coal and natural gas, right? So SDS and net zero. SDS is basically the Paris goals. Net zero is something that you hear a lot of large companies talk about, like as if they're already close to achieving it, which I personally believe the challenge of net zero is a lot more daunting than what a large companies are making it seem to be at this moment in time. But just to show you, I mean, for existing uses, meaning continuing to make fertilizer and feed the planet, as well as power generation and maritime fuel, because you're not emitting any carbon when you use the ammonia in a combustion engine or in a fuel cell, that's how the maritime and power sectors plan to decarbonize. Now, so you can see we're talking, you know, more than double or even triple how much ammonia is going to be needed in the next couple decades. Now, what makes it even more challenging is all of this has to be made from electricity and water, not from coal and natural gas. So this isn't my words. This is what you know, I like to say, you know, we didn't come up with this idea. You know, whether somebody says we're stealing the idea or whether I'm saying we're replicating what they're talking about in Europe and what the IEA is saying just simply needs to happen and happen quickly, meaning in the next couple decades. So for a long time we were waiting for the Clean Fuel Standard to come out. And it has come out. And when it came out, there was also something called the Clean Fuel Fund, federally. And it's big on hydrogen, no doubt, which I thought was good. It's big on a lot of other types of fuels, but nowhere in it did it mention ammonia. And so we put together an application, got some other companies on board that thought it was interesting, wanted to put their name on it as well. We submitted an application where we said, hey, we're proposing an ammonia project, even though you don't list ammonia as a eligible fuel. And the good news is that when they came back with the actual call for proposals, they added ammonia as an eligible fuel. And they said, but it's got to be a pretty big project. But the size of the project they picked was the exact size of the project that we proposed. So, you know, we're definitely on the radar for the Clean Fuels Fund. But the one issue is there are little to no end users today for hydrogen and ammonia as a fuel. What we proposed was that we were going to use ammonia as anhydrous or as the basis of ammonium nitrate production in a long-term vision. So I don't even want to tell you, some of the feedback we've gotten is a little iffy on, because it's not a fuel and it's a fertilizer, eligibility may be in question. So we're sorting through that. Unfortunately, it's just the normal, you know, we're not relying at this point in time, like our company is going full steam ahead on trying to develop the asset to a point where a large co-investor wants to come in and build a project with or without the Clean Fuels Fund. And we think technically it makes sense, right thing to do from a greenhouse gas reduction point of view, and given what's happening elsewhere around the world right now. Talk about this tractor for a sec, just because there are, you know, if you look to what's happening in Europe, either dual fuel diesel and hydrogen combustion engines, and in the shipping industry, dual fuel diesel, bunker C, and ammonia, meaning mixing the two as a transition fuel to try and get the carbon emissions out of burning the fuel, but at the same time not relying completely on hydrogen supply, clean hydrogen supply, because we need more of it, and it doesn't exist nearly as much as it should yet. And ammonia is the same. Now you can also see just another idea from the I'll call it, you know, farm sector. The first milk truck on zero emission hydrogen is on the road in Holland. So, but a lot of what we do is look at what's happened in Europe. I can't help it, you know. And this, you can't read the top maybe as well as we'd like, but we're not proposing something state of the art or risky. This is technology that's been proven for over 100 years, right? And the reason I don't say that 100% of the ammonia made around the world has come from fossil fuels is because there's 2 projects in Northern Europe, in Norway to be precise, that did exactly what we've been proposing, right? Which is to take electricity and water, make the hydrogen to make anhydrous, to make nitrogen fertilizer, right? It's kind of like what's old is new. They did that 100 years ago because during wartime in Norway the fossil fuels supply was cut off. And they said we still need to make ammonia. How else are we going to make it? Well, we're going to make it from the good old-fashioned science class where we take water and a little bit of direct current electricity and the water splits into hydrogen and oxygen. You've got to do that at scale, right? And do that at with a commercial product. So, I mean, this particular company, there are 3 companies well, 3 Canadian companies, 3 Ontario companies that are electrolyzers, those are called electrolyzers, that are electrolyzer technology firms. You know, there's probably only a dozen electrolyzer technology firms that are credible in the world, and we have 3 based in Ontario. So that's what those are. That's taking water and electricity, splitting it into hydrogen and oxygen. Right beside this plant was Yara. You guys have probably heard of Yara. They're one of the biggest ammonia producers in the world. So they were taking, like I said, the hydrogen from here to make anhydrous. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to explain what's going on in the world. So, but I do want to talk about the timing, right? Because we developed this idea and submitted back last September, right? So just to give you an idea of where the pricing was, because I assume that'll be a big question. Well, how much is it going to cost to make this anhydrous or ammonium nitrate, for example? So I just want to show like kind of where we were at the level of engineering where we're at. And you know, we need to do a lot more engineering is where we're at. And you know, to give you an idea, you know, we're working towards getting to a 30% engineering level of completeness for the project, right? And it takes a lot of work. But that can get you, you know, maybe not all the fine details, like all the stamp drawings and all those sorts of things, but it can get you to the point where you understand how much will it cost, how long is it going to take, what are the long lead time risks, you know, and those sorts of things, which is what we need to get a co-investor to make an investment to build the project with us. But when we brought some of our team on board, a number of companies that put a lot of work into this, you know, we were definitely higher than the 5-year average, but we were less than where it got to at the end of last year, right? And so just to give you a range of that's about where we are now. Of course, since the war broke out, you know, there's another dimension to the story, which is what we would like to work towards is offering. It's not just about the price, it's about the term, how long we can offer certain prices forward. And hopefully that could bring some stability to some of the volatility that's come with importing from places like China and Russia, which just, if we want to look at ammonium nitrate, this is a graphic, you know, it's kind of hard to get our heads around, but if you look at ammonium nitrate exports, right, so who exports the most ammonium nitrate in the world to lots of places around the world? You know, Russia's 2.5 times more than the next 4 largest combined. And China's not even on the next 4. I think most of you guys will probably know where the old Blue Water Detention Center was. It's been bought by the Municipality of Central Huron from Infrastructure Ontario. It's 300 acres. It has 30 acres fenced in high security fence. So, you know, the binding letter of intent is what we have, which is like a starting point. There still needs to be a lease agreement. There still needs to be zoning changes. There still needs to be a lot of public consultation and awareness and input and everything else to make sure we get this right. But we wanted to start with going to the stakeholders. So municipalities, neighboring municipalities, the local First Nation. So, I mean, ultimately it's going to take all 4 levels of government to make this project a success. But we started in the Bruce region. But a lot of the best attributes for the project were in Huron County. And so it was the end of last year that we entered that letter of intent with Central Huron. But the first thing we had to do, before we wasted anybody's time, was make sure how much clean electricity can we get at that location. Because if we can't get the quantity of electricity that can justify a pretty big project, then we're just going to be, like I said, wasting people's time. So the reason that we've now started accepting public engagements and getting out there and trying to have more and more public meetings is because we do have confidence after a lot of iterations, probably 6 months of iterations with the IESO, who controls the Ontario grid system, and Huron, who operates the transmission system, Hydro One, that we can get the amount of electricity that we need to justify a good starting point project. From the grid system, which is just over here outside the rail, as most of you know, that's where the 115 kV line is. Now, some other good attributes for the site. I mean, it has, firstly, it's in an area that's saturated with clean electricity at night. That's not true in all areas of Ontario. In other places of Ontario, you know, it's less saturated or not saturated at all. But as you guys probably know, in the Huron-Bruce region, the grid system, which is what we're connecting to, has a lot of clean electricity sort of bottlenecked in the region. So this project, and you'll see later on, the whole intent is to use off-peak electricity, right? Most of the hydrogen production will be made during nighttime hours, when the grid demand is low. When you increase demand, when the grid demand is low, you actually lower the cost of running the electricity system, right? Same electricity system, but more customers, more revenue at night, not during peak, right? So that increases affordability of electricity for all Ontario ratepayers. And again, that's talked about in the low carbon hydrogen strategy as a, you know, as a co-benefit. We do talk a little bit about the future potential for the site. If you look at where most hydrogen projects are being developed around the world, and ammonia projects are being developed around the world, it's in places like Texas, places like Australia, but always on top of where there's salt geology. Okay? In the first couple phases of this project, we're not proposing to store any hydrogen in specifically designed salt caverns to store hydrogen. We're not proposing that, but we are talking about looking at it and the potential of it, because in Ontario there is salt geology and it should be assessed. Of course, tons of engineering has to be done safe, has to be done with all the right assessments, everything else. But that is a future benefit. Now, you can't just do that anywhere, because if you do that, when you develop these caverns, you need to have some place to deal with the brine, right? And so it is just ideally co-located with, you know, an evaporator plant in Goderich that could actually deal with the brine. Yeah, rail, highway, but I also want to mention, you know, because we presented to the town of Goderich, we presented to the Port of Goderich, Port Management Corporation. They've been fantastic. They're talking about their own planning, right, and trying to look at expansion plans for the port, and they really welcome and have been very supportive in our vision, which could help Port of Goderich become a clean fuels and clean fertilizer exporter to the seaway, right? And lastly, ideally, the long-term goal would be, could they become a bunkering facility for ships in the seaway? So instead of ships pulling up to Hamilton or Sarnia to fill up with bunker C or diesel, in the future, could Goderich become a major stop on Highway H2O to fuel ships with clean hydrogen and clean ammonia. Yeah, so this is just a Yara document from Europe. It's, you know, the front page of the document says it's crops I want, not CO2. We think, you know, the power to ag, for all the reasons we just talked about, on the nitrogen fertilizer production capacity opportunity is no doubt core to our vision, but it's also just flat out an alternative to carbon tax, right? So we're talking about providing clean fuels where there would be no carbon tax because there's no carbon in the fuel, in both the hydrogen and ammonia, right? Like if we could get, and trust me, I've tried, and I could use some help trying to get, you know, New Holland to allow those dual fuel tractors from Belgium and Holland. If we can build this sort of project, let's get them over. Let's get that technology over here, right? That's flat out just avoiding carbon tax. Of course, we talked about nitrogen fertilizer security. Also talking about receiving the fair share of hydrogen investment. You hear a lot of talk about hydrogen in Canada right now, and it's kind of from two main places. One is from Alberta, where it's, and I hope for all our sakes it works, but it's based on the promise and hope of blue hydrogen as a color. Blue hydrogen means you still take fossil fuels, you strip the hydrogen off it, but you capture the carbon and you put it away forever. And there's a lot of, I'm going to say hype at this point, but I also hope it works. Like I said, for all of our sakes. You hear about Newfoundland, right? Newfoundland's planning on taking clean electricity from hydroelectric, maybe even from more renewables, making hydrogen, converting it to ammonia, and shipping it to Germany to help Germany with their energy supply situation, and the rest of Europe with the Ukraine shortages and everything else. And I say that's great. I'm not disagreeing with it. In fact, I might even be like, you know, violently in agreement with it, right? It should be done. But why are we doing that, shipping anhydrous essentially to Europe when we're not even taking care domestically of nitrogen fertilizer shortages, or the risk of nitrogen fertilizer shortages in the future, and the risk of price instability in the future, when we can do it all right here? So I'm saying both should be done, and I think, you know, Newfoundland, sure, maybe there's a lot of reasons why geographically and everything else could make sense to ship to Europe, but I'm saying why not right here in Huron-Bruce, and we can supply it to Huron-Bruce, we can become a net producer and supply it through the seaway or by rail to elsewhere to markets in North America. Job creation, yeah, I always just say our jobs, the types of jobs that we employ people is high-skilled blue-collar jobs, and that's exactly what would come with a development like this. You know, of course, construction jobs always sound like a lot, but it's, you know, in the thousands, maybe 3,000. Engineering construction phase jobs, but even long-term jobs, you know, the math works out to be somewhere between 1,500, you know, permanent jobs. Extensive training, you know, there's a huge gap right now where if the transition away from fossil fuels and the rapid deployment of hydrogen and electro fuels, like hydrogen and ammonia, need to be rapidly adopted. Like, we need to start training skilled trades. So, I mean, there's a lineup of trained colleges and universities that want to be part of this project, if we're going to go ahead. And then, of course, you know, the big reason behind this, and the reason we started this back in 2016, was purely based on it's a big climate solution, right? Like, the international community is saying we need clean fuels, we need to get off fuels that have a lot of carbon in it. You know, it's not just coal, oil. I mean, it's diesel, whether we all burn a lot of diesel, myself included. Next couple decades, we got to be figuring out how to get pretty much completely off. As hard as that is to imagine, I just take that face value. That's what the scientists are telling us. So I don't want anybody to misunderstand and think we're asking for special electricity deals. That's not what we're asking for. We're going to use off-peak electricity, and we're going to be a load that can dial back if the grid system says, whoa, 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 we're getting too loaded up here. We don't want you on. We will dial back. And during peak time frames, not affect peak, meaning be completely off the grid, let's call it, although it just means ramping back with production to the point where we're not running. We're running during peak and some mid-peak time frames, but never during high peak demand on the grid system. So there is a proposed regulation. It's not a regulation yet, and I know how difficult it is to get proposed regulations across finish lines, but we're not relying on it. But if we were considered under the proposed regulation, which is called accelerated growth in hydrogen energy through electricity rate options, if we say we're going to be interruptible, you tell us to back off, we back off, and that means we're going to largely consume most of our electricity at night because we want to be ready to never, impact your grid system during peak time frames. And we're proposing that if this proposed regulation were to go ahead, we'd be an ideally suited project for that program. One other thing I wanted to, hopefully start socializing with everyone is what's happening in Europe, and we need to get started with it here, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one, is pipelines, but hydrogen pipelines. And whether that means hydrogen in the pipes with the natural gas and methane, yes, but it also means we need to get on with pure hydrogen pipelines, because that's what's happening in Texas, that's what's happening in Europe already. So this is the 30-something Enbridges of Europe, right? And this is their plan. This isn't an idea, it's not a strategy, it's their plan. They have a mandate and they're going to build this plan, according to them. All in agreement that they're going to have 11,600 kilometers of pure hydrogen pipeline in the ground by 2030. That's not that far away, right? 5 years later, 26,000, we're going to double it. 2040, it's all largely going to be hydrogen pipelines replacing natural gas pipelines. This looks a lot like Ontario, just to be frank, so it's not out of the question. Ontario has more than 40,000, but not double that, kilometers of pipeline in the ground. So I just like pointing this out. I'm not saying that we need to phase out natural gas pipelines tomorrow. I would never say that. But we do need to start looking at rapid increase in the amount of hydrogen we blend into the pipelines, and a future where it's new hydrogen pipelines and converted natural gas pipelines to become hydrogen carrying pipelines, which is exactly what Europe's split is. It's about 60-40. New to converted. Anyhow, it all starts with one project, which again, I like to say, we're just trying to replicate what's happening in Europe. You talk about clean electricity, whether it's nuclear, wind, hydroelectric, solar, I don't care, it's all clean electricity. We need to take that and make clean fuels. As most of you guys know, Ontario's grid system is very clean. Off peak, it's extremely clean, right? Which is largely when we're talking about using electricity. So this is bona fide clean fuels, world class. We're trying to do what Europe's already planning to have its first phase in 2024. I'll admit, if everything went absolutely perfect, the absolute best case scenario to actually have an ammonia facility at the Blue Water Center, is 2026, which is only if everything went absolutely perfect, which it's not likely to do, unfortunately. That's just reality. So we're a bit behind, but we got to start somewhere, and that's why we think the Blue Water Center, for a couple reasons. One, I talked about the salt geology. The other thing I will mention, though, is there's no doubt ammonia, as most of you guys know, it's something you need to handle very carefully, right? Building an ammonia plant, there are regulations. We made our decision to go ahead with some of the agreements we've entered into based on we were absolutely sure we comply with all the regulations that apply. Then there's something that's way more stringent than the regulations, which is called the industry code of practice for ammonia plants. So this is what the ammonia producers in North America came together and said, well, let's put a code of practice together. Like, how far does an ammonia facility have to be set back from all these different things? And just to give you an idea, it makes it very easy to expand an ammonia plant, but very difficult to build a new ammonia plant. Just to paraphrase, right? So we're building a new ammonia plant. So I was like, wow, these are pretty tough setback distances. But we did our own analysis, and then we actually went through Fertilizer Canada right up to the code developer for Fertilizer Canada to look at, are we right? Like, does the Blue Water Center comply with the industry code of practice? And we're right. So, and he didn't, quite frankly, think there was many places or any places in southwestern Ontario where you could actually build a new ammonia plant. So, you know, taking what experts are telling us at face value, it has great geology for future hydrogen hub big project, potentially, in the future. That's not what we're proposing phase one. It's more a manageable, what the grid can give us. We're going to take all of it, make hydrogen, hopefully make ammonia. Well, it's time for question and answer. Anyway, happy to take any questions. Yeah, so no doubt, like, and I've heard the story from everyone from cousins to farmers to, you know, neighbors, everything else. So I did go and talk to one of the 6 anhydrous users still left in Ontario. There's only 6, right? 6. Used a fair bit. Like, just to be honest with you, we only, you know, if there were 10 of those guys, you know, we could make that amount of fertilizer in phase 1, right? And but the key point there is our goal is for the ammonia to be used as ammonia as a fuel. Right? It's about production capacity. We're trying to build capacity to fuel things with zero carbon fuels in the future. So the anhydrous part, it's either, and hopefully, you know, for example, just to put things in perspective, if you added up all of those 6, you know, the guy that I was meeting with isn't the biggest. You know, so we're getting in the neighborhood of phase 1. But, you know, again, we're laser focused on it being production capacity for a fuel. And, you know, I will say though that, like, and you guys probably know this, but anhydrous gets made at scale every day in Ontario, put on rail cars and shipped out west, right? And in fact, the farmers the farm that I'm speaking with, you know, he wants that anhydrous. And this is a year where he's being told it's all going out west. You can't get it yet. You can't get it. You can't get it yet. And the price is all over the place, like you guys know, right? So I'm not trying to talk anybody to go back into using anhydrous, right? Now, I don't know if we had all 4 levels of government working with us and we could get the price down to something. Is there potentially a compelling case for some guys to go back to the way it was in the 60s? Don't know. I'm not trying to convince anyone, right? And I will say though, you know, the biggest vision we have would be to actually build an ammonium nitrate facility in the future, right? With all the right processes and approvals, permitting, engineering, everything else in place, right? And that, you know, just to give you an idea, it's big, infrastructure scale, but the first phase would maybe be, call it 100 tons of ammonium nitrate per day. Not crazy. Like when you look at how much ammonium nitrate is being used or blended into other, you know, fertilizers that's being used across Ontario, let alone just Huron brews, right? So, anyhow, yeah, again, I don't ever want to get into that debate to try to talk anybody into the idea of going back to anhydrous or the benefits of ammonium nitrate versus other fertilizers. I will say, right or wrong, and again, I'm not an ag, you know, I'm not an ag specialist, right? But what the IEA is saying is that globally, right, in the next couple decades, the IEA does recommend a reduction in urea-based fertilizers to be replaced by ammonium nitrate-based fertilizers. That's for overall greenhouse gas emission contribution to global emissions. That's not specific to Huron Bruce or any other area, and I don't really want to get into that. But just globally looking at, because again, if we got back into that first slide and you look at how things are obtained, like it's a very carbon emitting process, making urea, right? Making anhydrous, making urea from cold natural gas. Globally, that's how most of it's made. So again, we're just talking about what can we make productive use of with a lot of clean electricity that's available in Ontario off-peak and water and not have any carbon in the supply chain. Have they improved it? Yeah, I mean, I will say that, you know, that company that was in the picture 100 years ago, like that's called Nell. It used to be Norsk Hydro, now it's Nell. I assume that stands for Norsk electrolyzer, but yeah, I mean, there's two types of technology, and the one is like, I would call it the Mack truck, and the other is like the Porsche, you know, so in this particular case, it could be either that wins, but there's usually like a good case for using one versus the other. So you're referring to like how much nickel is used in alkaline electrolysis, for example, right? Versus maybe platinum in other hydrogen applications like fuel cells or other things. Anyhow, all I can do is point towards the advancements in the size and scale and the pipeline of orders, right? So there's no doubt it consumes electricity. It consumes a lot of electricity, right? But what the energy and auto experts and superpowers of the world are saying is we have two things. Take transportation, for example. The split is going to be kind of like gasoline and diesel. If something can use gasoline, maybe a battery electric solution might work for it if it needs to be zero emission. But if it has heavy payload, cold weather performance is an issue. If it has needs horsepower or range, the only replacement for diesel it's not just me waving this flag anymore. I've been waving that since 2009. But the energy and auto superpowers are saying it needs to be hydrogen. So it's only a benefit environmentally when the hydrogen comes from clean sources. And the only way to do that, there's a lot of different ways that are pre-commercial, but if we're talking about commercial ways, like I think what you're asking, like commercial products, can you buy something that's a lot more efficient now than it was years ago? Yes. But I don't ever want to avoid the topic that it consumes a lot of electricity. And that's the point, though. We're talking about electrifying things, like electrifying the sectors that are hardest to electrify, like transportation, industry, and in this case, making ammonia is up there with making steel, cement. Those are the big three industries in terms of overall greenhouse gas emissions in making the product, right? So it's always that trade-off, right, between efficiency and cost and carbon. That's where we're at. But I think Ontario, and I think we're kind of the envy of the world in terms of like ideally suited with a clean grid that we've already invested in that currently has daytime peaks that may be a bit of a challenge, and no doubt, but off-peak electricity, there's a very clean, tangible, immediately available clean electricity resource, which is what we're proposing, to make productive use of and start electrifying ammonia production. Yeah, so like I said before, I mean, it's getting to the point where it's unrealistic to even say 2026, but the earliest, we could possibly be through the engineering, through the procurement, through the construction, have all the financing in order, is 2026. It's impossible to be up and running before that. To give you an idea of water, though, it's a great question. For that first phase that we talked about, it would be about an Olympic swimming pool a month to make the hydrogen, and it would be about an Olympic swimming pool a month, this is talking about consumption, right, to cool the ammonia process. All ammonia processes have to be near the water for cooling, right? I didn't describe in the beginning, like we've been building hydrogen production equipment and making hydrogen at our shop in North Bruce since about 2009. And there's a couple of cool projects that we were lucky enough to be part of with Canadian Tire. So Canadian Tire actually bought some products and asked us to do the engineering and contracting to install and commission the equipment to make hydrogen on site to fuel their material handling equipment, their forklifts, their shunt trucks, and hopefully soon to be their Class 8 tractor trailers, right? So we're talking about fueling hundreds of forklifts and shunt trucks and these sorts of devices, and it's basically a garden hose that connects the water to the electrolysis. It is kind of mind-boggling how much hydrogen is in water. Like, but there's lots of things on the internet that you can see that for yourself. Like I said, it's I think a reasonable amount of water, and to compare it to business as usual is something I'd like to do, because even when you use fossil fuels instead of electrolysis, water electrolysis, it consumes about the same amount of water. Because the way you get the hydrogen off the methane, for example, is called steam methane reformation. Steam, right? So It's a major steam process, major consumer of methane, major emitter of carbon. To get the hydrogen off, it also consumes a lot of water. So that would all be part of the engineering studies. It would be analyzing all the different options for where water could come from, right? Which there's only a few obvious ones, and showing how it complies with permits and regulations, how it complies with other businesses in the area. Like, you know, when you actually get into how much water a concrete mixing plant consumes, I think you'll be shocked, to be honest with you. When you compare it to things that we just take for granted every day and don't bat an eye at, more of those plants in our backyard, right? So I think you'll find the comparison really favorable, and that'll all be in the engineering studies. In terms of megawatts, right? A lot of people think in megawatts, so at nighttime, we would be looking at taking 50 megawatts for phase one. So phase two, we haven't actually finished the engineering on that with Hydro One and the ISO, but we have gone through enough iterations to know what a reasonable ask is, and we're going to make that reasonable ask, and then if they think the engineering looks good, we put down security deposits for phase two as well. Phase two is looking for 200 megawatts at night. And when the reality is that Bruce nuclear units are dialed back a bit if they can, right? At that point, all the wind turbines blades, I don't want to get into wind, I don't want to get into debate about wind, that'd be the last thing I want to do right here. So, but you know, when Bruce dials back that little bit that they can, which is, I'm all for that, all the wind turbines in Ontario, at least in the area, connected to the same grid system, we just got the blades turned when you're going by. So we're talking about we're not talking about adding generation tax. We're talking about using infrastructure, and it's not just about wind, it's about hydroelectric spilling. You know, I once did a presentation years ago to the CEO at the time of OPG, and we were done the presentation, and the deputy minister looked over at the CEO of OPG and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I think this is exactly what we should be doing. Like the amount of water that we spill every night, just because, you know, the capacity has to be there for daytime peaks, but nighttime nobody's using it. So water's spilling over the dams, wind turbine blades are letting the wind go by. There's no solar because it's not on anyhow. And if the nukes are backing off, if they can back off, they will back off. You know, what we're talking about, again, to be crystal clear, is we're talking about using more off-peak electricity, which I can't stress enough, like, it is how we increase affordability for Ontario ratepayers. This brings down the cost of global adjustment. There's no rocket science to that, it's just math, and that's what even the low carbon hydrogen strategy for Ontario highlights. Anyhow, thanks for having me again, and happy